The biting December wind whipped across the flat, barren fields of Camp Sheridan, Alabama, a place that felt 1,000 miles from anywhere and 1,000,000 miles from home. For Anya Schmidt, it was a world away from the snow-dusted pines of the Black Forest she remembered from Christmases past. Here, the mud was a constant, greedy presence, sucking at their worn boots and clinging to the hems of their drab U.S. Army-issue coats. Anya, once a decorated signal operator in the Luftwaffe, was now just a number, POW 387. She stood in the morning line for roll call, her back ramrod straight, her chin held high despite the gnawing cold and the hollow ache in her stomach. Her fellow prisoners, a collection of nurses, clerks, and auxiliary personnel captured during the Normandy campaign, shivered beside her, their faces etched with a familiar blend of fatigue and despair. They were all young, most barely out of their teens, and now they were on the wrong side of the world, prisoners of an enemy they had been taught to despise. The American guards watched them with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. To them, these women were a strange novelty, the she-wolves of the Reich they'd read about in sensationalist papers. The one who seemed to enjoy their misery the most was Sergeant Miller, a stocky man with a perpetually sour expression and a gaze that stripped away any last shred of dignity. He swaggered down the line, his boots making squelching sounds in the mud, his eyes lingering on each woman with a sneer. "Look at 'em," he'd grumble to the younger privates. "Think they're so tough? Bet they're crying for their mommies at night." Anya's jaw tightened at his words, but she kept her eyes fixed on the distant water tower, a stark silhouette against the gray sky. She had learned early on that reacting only fueled his cruelty. He saw her composure not as strength but as arrogance, a challenge to his authority. He often singled her out. "You, 387, he barked one morning, stopping directly in front of her. "Still think you're something special? That fancy uniform you wore is long gone. Here, you're just another kraut, scrubbing floors and peeling potatoes." He was trying to get a rise out of her, to see the defiance in her eyes crack. Anya had been an officer, respected for her skill and courage under fire. She had coordinated air traffic during intense raids, her calm voice a steady presence in the chaos. Miller knew this from her file, and he used it like a weapon. But Anya refused to give him the satisfaction. She met his gaze, her blue eyes as cold and clear as a winter sky, and said nothing. Her silence was her shield and her sword. It infuriated him more than any retort could. The days leading up to Christmas were the hardest. The cold seemed to seep deeper into their bones, and the meager rations did little to warm them. Whispers of home, of families gathered around crackling fires, of the scent of gingerbread and roasting goose, circulated through the barracks like ghosts. For many of the women, it was their first Christmas away from their loved ones, and the weight of their captivity felt heavier than ever. Tears were shed in the quiet darkness of the long nights, muffled by thin blankets so the guards wouldn't hear. Anya remained a pillar of strength for the others. She organized work details to be more efficient, ensuring the younger, weaker girls weren't given the most strenuous tasks. She shared her own small bread ration with a girl named Liesel, who was wasting away from homesickness. "We must endure," Anya would tell them in a low, firm voice. "We are German soldiers. We do not break." But in the solitude of her bunk when the others were asleep, Anya allowed the memories to flood in. She saw her father, his eyes twinkling as he placed the star on top of the Christmas tree. She heard her mother humming Silent Night while arranging nativity figures on the mantelpiece. She could almost taste the sweet, warm stollen her grandmother used to bake. These memories were a double-edged sword. They were a source of comfort, a reminder of who she was beyond the number on her uniform. But they also carved a deeper hole in her heart. She was strong, but she was not made of stone. One afternoon, a week before Christmas, a new rumor began to spread through the camp, carried on the wind like a strange, unbelievable melody. The camp commander, a stern but fair man named Captain Davies, had announced that the prisoners would be allowed to celebrate Christmas, not just a day off from their duties, but a real celebration. The women reacted with a mix of disbelief and deep suspicion. "It's a trick," one of them, a former nurse named Ingrid, hissed. "They want to mock us, to parade us around and laugh at our traditions." "Maybe they will poison the food," another whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Sergeant Miller did his best to reinforce their fears. "Don't you worry, girls," he sneered as he oversaw them cleaning the latrines. "We'll give you a Christmas you won't forget. A real American-style Christmas. Maybe we'll hang you from the tree instead of ornaments." His cruel laughter echoed off the damp concrete walls. Yet, despite his words, strange things began to happen. A truck arrived at the camp gates and unloaded a dozen large pine trees. The scent of fresh pine, so reminiscent of home, drifted into their barracks, stirring a painful longing in their hearts. Then, boxes of decorations were brought into the mess hall, tinsel, glass ornaments, and strings of colored lights. The prisoners were tasked with decorating the hall, their hands trembling as they handled the fragile baubles. It felt like a dream, a cruel mirage. Anya watched it all with a guarded heart. She didn't trust it. Kindness from an enemy was more unsettling than outright hostility. It felt like a psychological game, a new form of torment designed to break their spirit in a way that cold and hunger could not. She worked alongside the others, her movements precise and detached, her face an unreadable mask. "Why are they doing this?" Liesel asked her, her voice barely a whisper as she carefully hung a silver star on a branch. "I do not know," Anya replied honestly. "But do not let your guard down. Remember where we are. Remember who they are." The day before Christmas Eve, the camp cook, a large, quiet man named George, approached Anya while she was on kitchen duty, peeling a mountain of potatoes. He was one of the few Americans who never spoke to them with malice. He mostly kept to himself, but Anya had noticed the way he sometimes slipped an extra piece of bread onto the trays of the thinnest girls. He cleared his throat, not quite meeting her eyes. "Heard you know a thing or two about music," he mumbled, gesturing vaguely with a ladle. Anya's eyes narrowed slightly. "What of it? Her file?" They had all been interrogated. She had told them her father was a music teacher, that she played the piano. It was a small, personal detail she had instantly regretted sharing. George shifted his weight. "The commander. He found an old, beat-up piano in the town's church basement. They're bringing it to the mess hall." He thought. "Well, he thought you might be willing to play something for the others." He finally looked at her, his expression not of pity, but of simple human decency. "Some Christmas carols. You know, Silent Night, Stille Nacht. It's the same song, ain't it?" Anya stared at him, her mind reeling. Play for them? For her captors? For the women who looked to her for strength? It felt like a surrender, a performance for the enemy's amusement. She could feel Sergeant Miller's mocking gaze on her even though he wasn't there. He would stand in the back, laughing at the trained monkey playing for her supper. "No," she said, her voice sharp and final. She turned back to her potatoes, her knuckles white as she gripped the peeler. George stood there for a moment longer, then sighed softly and walked away without another word. The scent of pine and the distant sound of hammering from the mess hall filled the air. That night, as she lay on her bunk, the cold felt more profound than ever. It wasn't just the Alabama winter chilling her. It was a cold that came from deep within, a fortress of pride and anger she had built to survive. But for the first time, she wondered if the walls of her fortress were not just keeping the enemy out, but also locking herself within. The thought of Stille Nacht, a song her mother had sung to her every Christmas Eve, echoed in her mind. It was a song of peace, of hope, and here, in this place of mud and wire, those words felt like the most dangerous form of contraband. Christmas Eve arrived on a wave of frigid air, the sky a bruised purple that promised no warmth. The women of Barracks C were quiet, lost in their own worlds of memory and apprehension. The mess hall, now decorated with fragrant pine boughs and shimmering tinsel, stood waiting. An old upright piano, its wood scarred and yellowed with age, had been placed on a small raised platform in the corner. It looked out of place, a relic of a gentler time dropped into their harsh reality. Anya had not spoken of the cook's request to anyone, but she felt the weight of it. Throughout the day, she saw Liesel and some of the other younger women casting hopeful glances her way. They knew of her musical talent. She had sometimes hummed old folk tunes to lift their spirits during grueling work details. They didn't dare ask, but their silent pleading was a heavy burden. To them, music was a direct link to the home they so desperately missed. To Anya, it was a piece of her soul she was not willing to share with her captors. Sergeant Miller seemed to be in exceptionally high spirits, his usual sneer replaced with a wide, malicious grin. "Big night tonight, ladies," he announced during the afternoon roll call, his voice dripping with false cheer. "The commander wants you all to have a good time, so you better look happy. I want to see smiles, you hear me? Anyone who doesn't look like they're having the time of their life will be on latrine duty for a week." His threat hung in the air, twisting the already complicated knot of emotions in their stomachs. This wasn't a celebration. It was a command performance. They were being ordered to be happy. The injustice of it was a bitter pill to swallow. As evening fell, they were instructed to wash and put on the cleanest clothes they had. They were then marched not to the mess hall, but to a different building, the camp's small, rarely used infirmary. Inside, laid out on the cots, were simple, clean dresses. Not uniforms, but actual dresses in muted colors of blue, gray, and brown. They were second-hand, clearly donated by the women from the nearby town, but they were a shocking sight. For months, they had seen themselves only in baggy, shapeless fatigues. To see a dress, an object of femininity and normalcy, was profoundly disorienting. "What is this?" Ingrid murmured, touching the sleeve of a plain cotton dress as if it might burn her. "More games," Anya said, her voice low and steady, though a tremor of uncertainty ran through her. "They want to dress us up like dolls for their show." Reluctantly, they changed. The simple act of putting on a dress was transformative. It softened the hard lines of their posture, brought a different light to their eyes. As they looked at each other, they saw not just fellow prisoners, but glimpses of the women they used to be, the daughters, sisters, and sweethearts they had left behind. It was a painful, vulnerable feeling. When they were finally led into the mess hall, they stopped in their tracks. The long wooden tables had been covered with white paper cloths. In the center of each table sat a small candle, its flame flickering, casting a warm, gentle glow across the room. The smell of roasting meat, real meat, and baking bread filled the air, a scent so rich and intoxicating it made their heads spin. American guards, including a few who were usually stern and unsmiling, stood along the walls, but tonight they held no rifles. Their faces were uncharacteristically subdued, almost watchful. Captain Davies, the camp commander, stood near the front. He was a tall, somber man in his late 40s, with lines of worry etched around his eyes. He motioned for the women to take their seats. They moved slowly, cautiously, as if expecting a trap to spring at any moment. Once they were all seated, Captain Davies cleared his throat. "Ladies," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I know this is an unusual situation. For all of us, this war has taken us all far from our homes and our families." He paused, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "But tonight is Christmas Eve. It is a night that, for many of us, represents peace and goodwill. My country is not at war with you, the individual. We are at war with an ideology. Tonight we are not guards and prisoners. We are just people, a long way from home, trying to find a small measure of peace on a holy night." He gestured to the kitchen. The meal was prepared by our cooks, with help from the ladies of the local church. "Please eat." The women looked at each other, then at the food being brought out on large platters. There was roast turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, and fresh, soft rolls. It was a feast beyond their wildest imaginings. For a long moment, no one moved. The suspicion was too deeply ingrained. Then Liesel, her eyes filled with tears, picked up a roll. She sniffed it, then took a tiny, hesitant bite. Her eyes widened. It was real. Slowly, cautiously, the others began to serve themselves. The silence in the hall was broken by the quiet clinking of forks against plates. The food was not just nourishment. It was a powerful, undeniable act of kindness that chipped away at their defenses. Anya ate mechanically, her mind struggling to process the scene. The warm, well-lit hall, the delicious food, the absence of overt hostility, it was all designed to disarm them, she thought. But as she looked at the faces of her fellow prisoners, she saw the hard shells of despair beginning to crack. A small, genuine smile touched Liesel's lips as she savored a spoonful of mashed potatoes. Ingrid, the cynical nurse, wiped a tear from her eye with the back of her hand. This kindness, whether a trick or not, was having a profound effect. After the meal, plates were cleared away and mugs of hot spiced cider were served. A young private, no older than 18, walked to the front of the room carrying a guitar. He sat on a stool and, with a nervous glance at Captain Davies, began to play. He sang American Christmas carols in a clear, boyish tenor. He sang of snow and sleigh bells, of chestnuts roasting on an open fire. The tunes were foreign, but the sentiment was universal. It was then that Sergeant Miller made his move. He strode to the center of the room, a smug look on his face. "Well, that was real nice, son," he said to the private, dismissing him with a wave. "But I think these ladies would like to hear something a little more familiar." His eyes locked onto Anya. "Our special guest, POW 387, is a talented piano player. Let's have her come up here and play us a little something from the fatherland. How about it, 387? Don't be shy." The room went silent. Every eye, German and American, turned to Anya. This was it. The moment of humiliation she had been dreading. He wanted to make a spectacle of her, to force her to perform like a pet. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to stand up and spit in his face. She could feel the anger rising in her, hot and fierce. She stood up, her movements stiff. She walked towards the piano, her heart pounding in her chest. Miller's grin widened. He thought he had won. He thought he was about to break her. Anya sat down on the hard wooden bench. The keys were yellowed and chipped. She ran her fingers over them, the cool ivory a familiar sensation beneath her touch. She took a deep breath, and in that moment she was not POW 387. She was Anya Schmidt, daughter of a music teacher from a small village in the Black Forest. And this music, it was not his to command. It was hers. She would not play a bombastic, nationalistic anthem for him to mock. She would not play a jaunty folk tune for him to ridicule. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother. She thought of the flickering candlelight in their small living room, of the snow falling softly outside the window. She thought of peace. Her fingers found the keys, and the first gentle notes of Stille Nacht filled the hall. She played it softly, tenderly, the simple, beautiful melody speaking of a quiet, holy night. She didn't sing. She didn't need to. The music was a prayer in itself. After the first verse, a soft, trembling voice rose from one of the tables. It was Liesel. "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht," she sang, her voice thin but clear. Then another voice joined in, then another. Soon all the German women were singing, their voices blending in a harmony born of shared loss and a deep, aching homesickness. They sang of heavenly peace, their eyes closed, tears streaming down their faces. They were not singing for the Americans. They were singing for themselves, for their families, for a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of peace. Anya continued to play, the music flowing through her, a conduit for all the unspoken sorrow and hope in the room. When she looked up, she saw something that shocked her to her core. The young private with the guitar had tears in his eyes. The camp cook, George, stood by the kitchen door, his head bowed. Even some of the tougher guards looked uncomfortable, their gazes fixed on the floor. They were hearing the same song they had known since childhood, sung in a different tongue by women they called their enemy. In that moment, the language barrier melted away. The uniforms disappeared, and there were only people united by a simple, timeless melody. Captain Davies watched, his face impassive, but his eyes betraying a deep emotion. He was witnessing something he had not expected. This was not a command performance. This was something real, something powerful. Only one person seemed immune. Sergeant Miller stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of thunderous rage. This was not the humiliation he had planned. This was not a victory for him. It was a moment of profound, shared humanity, and it was a language he did not understand and could not tolerate. The final notes of Stille Nacht hung in the air, fragile and sacred. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft, muffled sobs of the women. Anya let her hands rest on the keys, a deep tremor running through her. She had not intended to create such a moment. She had only wanted to reclaim a piece of herself, but in doing so, she had given voice to the collective soul of everyone in the room, prisoner and guard alike. The shared vulnerability was a bond, but it was also a danger. She could feel Miller's hatred radiating across the hall like a physical force. Captain Davies stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Miss Schmidt," he said, using her name for the first time. The formal address was a small but significant gesture of respect. He then turned to the other women. "There is something else for you." He nodded to the guards standing by the walls. They moved to a corner of the room where a large canvas sheet covered a pile of objects. They pulled the sheet away, revealing dozens of small, hand-wrapped parcels. "The women from the town," Davies explained. "They wanted you to have a gift for Christmas. They know you are far from home. They prayed for you in their church service this morning." The prisoners stared in stunned silence. Gifts? From American civilians? It was incomprehensible. One by one, the guards, their faces unreadable, picked up the parcels and began distributing them, placing one in front of each woman. The paper was simple, some of it even newspaper, tied with scraps of yarn and string. Liesel carefully unwrapped hers. Inside was a pair of hand-knitted woolen socks and a small bar of soap. She burst into fresh tears, clutching the simple gifts to her chest as if they were priceless treasures. Ingrid opened hers to find a warm scarf and a small tin of hand cream. Each package contained something similar, practical, thoughtful items meant to offer a small comfort against the cold and the hardship of their lives. Anya's parcel was placed in front of her by the young private who had played the guitar. He avoided her eyes, a flush of color on his cheeks. "Merry Christmas, ma'am," he mumbled before quickly retreating. She slowly untied the yarn. Inside, she found a pair of thick gray mittens and a small leather-bound book. It was a book of poetry in German. Her breath caught in her throat. She opened the cover. On the inside page, in elegant, old-fashioned script, was an inscription, "From one mother to another's daughter. May peace find you soon." Anya traced the words with her finger, a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. A mother, an American mother, had sent this to her. A German soldier. This single anonymous act of compassion was more devastating to her defenses than any weapon. It bypassed the fortress of her pride and struck at the very core of her being. The anger and suspicion she had harbored for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a profound, aching gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. She, Anya Schmidt, who had prided herself on being unbreakable, finally broke. She bowed her head over the small book and wept. The atmosphere in the hall was one of quiet, tearful revelation. The divide between captor and captive, between enemy and ally, had blurred into something indistinct and profoundly human. But the moment was shattered by Sergeant Miller's raw, furious voice. "This is ridiculous," he roared, his face contorted with rage. He strode towards Captain Davies. "Giving them gifts? Singing their songs? What in God's name are you doing, sir? Have you forgotten there's a war on? These are the enemy. My brother is over there, fighting and dying in the snow, and you're in here having a party with them." His voice cracked on the last words, and for a fleeting second his rage gave way to a flash of raw pain. It was a wound he had been nursing with hatred. Captain Davies turned to face him, his expression calm but firm as steel. "I am well aware of the war, Sergeant. I am also aware that my duty is to this camp and everyone in it, according to the rules of war and the dictates of my own conscience. These women are prisoners, not monsters. And tonight is Christmas. Conscience?" Miller spat the word like poison. He pointed a trembling finger at Anya, who had looked up, her face stained with tears. "Ask her about conscience. Ask her what she was doing while our boys were being shot out of the sky. She was guiding their planes, that's what she was doing. She's got American blood on her hands just like all the rest of them." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Some of the guards shifted uncomfortably. Miller had crossed a line, airing his personal grief and turning it into a public indictment. Before Davies could respond, Anya stood up. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and faced her accuser. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it carried across the silent room. "You are right, Sergeant," she said, her German accent thick but her words clear. "I was a soldier. I followed my orders just as you follow yours. I did my duty to my country, just as your brother is doing for his." She took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "But you know nothing of my conscience. You see my uniform, but you do not see me." She paused, taking a breath. "My last act as a signals operator was not to guide bombers. It was to disobey a direct order. I was tracking a crippled American B-17 bomber. It was flying low, trailing smoke, trying to make it back to the coast. My orders were to vector fighters to destroy it." The room was utterly still. Every person was locked on her words. "But I had been monitoring the American radio frequencies," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I heard the pilot. He was young. He was talking to his crew, trying to keep them calm. He was talking about getting them home. I looked at my map. I knew there was a small, unused airfield in neutral territory just a few miles from their position, a place they could land safely." She looked directly at Miller, whose face had gone pale. "So I did not vector the fighters. Instead, I transmitted the coordinates for that airfield on the American emergency frequency. I used their call signs. I guided them in." "You're lying," Miller whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Am I?" Anya's gaze was piercing. "The plane was named the Memphis Belle II. The pilot's name was Lieutenant John Riley. There were 10 men on board. I never knew if they made it. I was arrested for insubordination a day later, just before my unit was overrun. That is why I am here, Sergeant. I am a prisoner of my own army as much as I am a prisoner of yours." A stunned silence filled the room. Captain Davies stared at Anya, then at his sergeant, his mind clearly working. He had read her file, but it had been brief, clinical. It would not have contained the details of her final actions. Suddenly, the young private who had played the guitar let out a small, choked sound. All eyes turned to him. His face was ashen. My uncle," he stammered, his voice trembling. "He was a tail gunner on a B-17. His plane went down over France last year. The whole crew was reported killed in action, but then, 6 months later, the Red Cross found them. They had made an emergency landing at a small, forgotten airfield. They had all survived." He looked from Anya to Captain Davies, his eyes wide with dawning, impossible realization. "The plane's name," he said, his voice cracking. "They called her the Memphis Belle II. My uncle's pilot. His name was John Riley." The connection, so improbable, so miraculous, electrified the room. It was a twist of fate so profound, it felt like a divine intervention. Anya stared at the young man, her hands flying to her mouth. The 10 men. They had lived. All this time, she had carried the uncertainty, the fear that her sacrifice had been for nothing. And now, on Christmas Eve in a POW camp in Alabama, she had her answer. The peace she had wished for them had found its way back to her. Sergeant Miller looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His rage, his hatred, the entire foundation of his worldview had crumbled in an instant. The woman he saw as a monster, the symbol of the enemy who had taken his brother, had saved the life of another American soldier, the uncle of a boy standing right here in this room. He staggered back, his face a mess of confusion, shame, and a grief that was no longer shielded by anger. He turned and fled the room. No one stopped him. In the silence he left behind, Captain Davies walked over to Anya. He stood before her for a long moment, his expression one of deep, profound respect. "On behalf of the United States Army," he said, his voice clear and strong for all to hear, "I believe we owe you a debt of gratitude. Miss Schmidt." That night, for the first time in a long time, Anya slept a deep and dreamless sleep. The American Christmas celebration had been more shocking than she could have ever imagined. She had entered the mess hall a prisoner, an enemy, a number. She left a woman whose act of courage and conscience had transcended the hatred of war, earning her not just redemption, but a justice she never knew she was seeking. In the heart of America, surrounded by her enemies, Anya Schmidt had finally found a measure of peace.